Hi everyone! In this lesson, we will be giving an introduction to authentication. First, we begin with sessions as a RESTful resource, which includes being able to apply actions like create, read, update, and destroy on a session. Then we're going to talk about the idea of using web application frameworks to handle authentication and session management. Then we're going to talk about using cookies to allow for a state and sessions in our web applications. Finally, we will talk about general guidelines for authentication. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to evaluate a system to determine if it follows the generally prescribed secure methods for authentication. Let's dive right in. So sessions can be conveniently thought of as a RESTful resource, and REST is an acronym for Representational State Transfer. One of the ideas of REST is that each request from the client to the server needs to have all of the information needed in order to understand that particular request. And the next main idea of REST is that requests are performed on a resource like a piece of data, for example, a file or the concept, like a session, as long as the resource can be uniquely identified using an identifier, for example, using a URL. So with that in mind, you can think of a session as first, with a login page, you would be forming a new session. So a REST example would be to add this request of get session login. And then with the act of logging in, you could think of it as creating a new session. So a REST request example would be post session login. And then with logging out, you could think of this as the act of destroying that session. So this REST example would be delete session logout. And these REST requests are HTTP requests. So when we think about authentication and session management, we might be tempted to create our own authentication session management subsystem. But we want to avoid doing that because logic and security issues could exist in our own authentication and session management subsystem. And it takes time for these to be found and fixed. But with current existing web application frameworks, they have been previously tested and tried on production, and previous bugs have been fixed. These are convenient to use because web application frameworks will already have the plumbing for authenticating users and creating and destroying sessions. So for example, with the language of Ruby, you can use Ruby on Rails as a web application framework, and it has something called the has secure password functionality, which adds methods to your user model to set and authenticate against a password. And when thinking about web application frameworks, you want to have certain criteria. At the very least, your web application framework should apply the secure and HTTP-only flags for the cookies that they use. And at the very least, that web application framework should set the domain and the path parameters for your cookies correctly. And at the very least, that web application framework should prevent session tokens from being included in URLs or accepted as URL parameters. Now, more detailed requirements can be found in OWASP's page called Cookie Theft and Session Hijacking. Now, when we think about cookies and how they are used to create stateful sessions, there are common patterns that are used by web applications today when they have logins and session management subsystems. So one common pattern is for allowing of temporary sessions, and how this is done is that a temporary cookie is given to the browser from the server, and here the browser forgets that cookie upon browser shutdown, and the session ID is encrypted and is used as the data in the cookie. Now with this sort of functionality of having temporary sessions, it might not be sufficient. Maybe you want users to be able to be remembered by your web application even after shutting down the browser. So the way this is done is using this common pattern of using a so-called remember token. So you can do this through an automatic remember functionality upon login, or be able to have the user click on a checkbox like a remember me checkbox option when they first log in. And the way this common pattern is done is that the server creates a remember token, and this remember token is basically a random string of digits, and it's a fixed length. And the server stores the remember token's hash digest in the backend database. Now note that I said the server stores the remember token's hash digest and not the remember token itself. So that's really key. Then the server sends the browser the remember token as a cookie, of course over encrypted channel. Also, the server encrypts a user ID, and that encrypted data is sent over to the browser as a cookie. So now here we have the browser having two cookies. First, the remember token, and second, the encrypted user ID. Now, when the client comes back to access the web application, it gives the server the encrypted user ID and the remember token. And now the server has these two pieces of data. And first, what it does is it unencrypts the user ID, and then it goes and checks its backend database to find that user ID. And then the next thing it does is it checks the client's remember token to see if it is the actual remember token that has been hashed in the backend database. So if this hash matches the hash of the client's remember token, then the server knows that that is the client with this particular session. So now here are some general guidelines for authentication. Now, user ID should be unique and case sensitive, I should say. And with passwords, you want to consider password length. According to NIST SP 8132, the minimum password length should be at least 10 characters. Anything below this is considered a weak password. Now you want to consider password complexity. So you want to enforce the password having at least one uppercase character, at least one lowercase character, at least one digit, and at least one special character like an exclamation mark or a $ symbol, for example. And then you want to consider password storage. We're going to talk more about this in the last module, Module 4. But what I'm going to say now is that in order to authenticate using passwords, we would store the hash of the password concatenated with a salt. More specifically, in order to generate the salt, which is a random string, you want to use a secure random string generator or string function to generate this salt. And once you have that salt, you want to concatenate it to the password, and then with a salt plus the password, so this whole string that's concatenated together, you want to put that through a secure hash like bcrypt, which hashes the concatenated string. That hash output is what you would store in the database and not the plaintext password. In other words, notice that we don't store the plaintext password directly in the backend database. So with login pages, you want to have it such that login pages and authenticated pages be accessed using TLS. So you want to make sure that communication between the browser and the web application on the server's side are encrypted. And you can use the HSTS header, as we learned earlier. The next thing you want to make sure to do is to force the users to re-authenticate when the user is trying to access a sensitive feature. This is to make sure that we guard against session hijacking. And then another thing that you want to make sure to do is to implement some sort of a lockout after a small number of unsuccessful authentication attempts. And this is so that we can guard against brute force attacks. So, for example, like guessing passwords. And more authentication guidelines can be found in OWASP. So in summary, we talked about thinking of sessions as a RESTful resource, and then we talked about avoiding rolling your own authentication and session management subsystem, and instead relying on web application frameworks, which already have this functionality. And we talked about these common patterns of authenticating and remembering sessions. And then last, we talked about some general guidelines for enforcing certain rules for authentication. Thanks for listening.